Cassie Miller on the piano, thank you for serenading us. And I mean, I think there's nothing left, but
with no further ado,
let's just go for it. Wait. Something seems wrong.
Hang on, Cassie. This isn't right.
Stand by.
I don't think we're close enough. Oh, there we go. That's better, right? There we go. Joseph and Ryan, everybody.
Look at these guys. Thank you.
Oh, that is much better.
That's better.
Oh,
that's better.
My guy. Oh. All right, Cassie, take us away.
Okay, thank you. The dragon, the great evil worm or fiery serpent that rules like the very manifestation of chaos. He rains terror down on those beneath him, leaves a train of destruction and venomous wasteland in his wake. The dragon has captured the imagination of mankind from what seems like the deeps of time. Why has this elusive creature taken such a tight hold on us? Why, despite some differences in form or behavior across culture and history, do we all still immediately recognize a dragon for a dragon when we see one? Could it be more than imagination? Could the tight hold this creature of doom has on our minds be memory? After all, the motif had to start somewhere. Let us find that starting place. Sing for me, O muse of scale and wing, of breath of poison and belly flame, of fang and metal master from the shadow. Sing of the high walls that guard the gates of deep time. We will swim through the vie waters of the world's ocean, fly over the mystic mountains of Asia to march the dunes of the Middle East, an ancient East where man's life was cradled in the womb of Earth's dust. We will trace old Roman roads to the farthest Northland, and through it all, we will stay nose to ground in eager wonder, following the desolations of the dragon. And we will begin, as is meet and right, with Genesis. In the Bible, the dragon is a common character. His name springs up in historical narrative, wisdom literature, songs, and prophecy. Across these varied genres, he takes different forms, but in all of them, he is most certainly present and active. His ubiquitous presence forces the modern Christian to reckon with the old adage, it can't all be metaphor. Why does Eve seem so unconcerned at the appearance of a talking snake? The first time we see Eve in real action is at her discourse with the serpent. Behind all of the existential meaning in their conversation, the fact of the conversation itself is puzzling. Here we have the first woman, and she seems entirely unbothered by the prospect of this creature from the garden coming up and speaking to her. But why is this? There have been many answers to this question posed through history. Perhaps the serpent was possessed by the devil, or maybe it was an earthly form assumed by the devil to sneak into the garden, a tip of our hat to John Milton. These answers are fair enough, no doubt, but they still do not help us understand why Eve is not surprised at talking to a snake. Was she under a magic spell? Some have said that it is because Adam and Eve spoke to all the animals before the fall, the green and angelic language of man's golden age that allowed all living creation to communicate with each other. This is Hermeticism. It is an esoteric fairy tale. And though not all fairy tales are untrue, this answer does not seem to cohere at all with the rest of the Genesis story. So what then? Are we hopeless? Maybe not. Maybe Eve was talking to the devil as the devil really was. Maybe the devil's true form was that of a serpent, a dragon. And maybe Eve was unfazed because she had spoken to other dragons before. The word seraph appears 7 times in the Hebrew Old Testament, twice in Numbers, once in Deuteronomy, and 4 times in the prophecy of Isaiah. The meaning of the word, which is most clearly brought to the foreground in Isaiah, is burning. We see the seraphim as angelic guardians of God's own holiness. Perfect holiness requires an eternal purity, of which God alone is the source. Hence his ministers, which guard this holy presence, exist in a constant state of purification made manifest, fire being a purifying thing. Thus, the seraphim are fiery. But there's another connection to be made with the word seraph. The word only refers to angels in the 2 occurrences in Isaiah. The other 5 instances, 2 in Numbers, 2 other uses in Isaiah, and 1 in Deuteronomy, actually serve another purpose. They are used in conjunction with the Hebrew word nahas, the word which refers to the serpent in Genesis 3:1, in order to create the translated English phrase, flying fiery serpent. 3 words that can be reduced to a single one, dragon. A flying fiery serpent, however big or small it is a dragon. The connection this makes for us is striking. This means that one of the angelic titles, indeed the title that denotes the highest order of the angels, is also a descriptor for a specific kind of serpent, one that flies and that is fiery. Could it be that one of the primary forms the seraphim takes is that of a dragon? Could it be inherent in their nature? Could it be that dragons are sometimes angelic entities, fallen or no? Well, again, maybe. This idea of the devil literally being a dragon, or of other angels being dragons, gathers strength when viewed in the light of certain other texts. For example, Revelation 12:9 states, "And the great dragon was thrown down, that ancient serpent, who is called the devil and Satan, the deceiver of the whole world. He was thrown down to the earth, and his angels were thrown down with him." Who is the deceiver of the whole world but the tempter in the garden? Who is the great enemy of man but the devil and Satan? And here he is called the great dragon. And yes, the Greek word here is the Greek word for dragon, drakon. Additionally, Job 26:13 uses the same serpentine word nahas in reference to the dragon constellation in the northern sky. At the very least, we are meant to see the devil as if he was a dragon, the embodiment of chaos and evil to man. But also remember, it can't all be metaphor. Maybe we're supposed to see the devil as a dragon, not only because that is what he's represented by in man's consciousness, but also because that's what he actually is. So we return to the question, why wasn't Eve shocked at a talking serpent? Perhaps because it was far from the first time she had spoken to a dragon. If angels still communed with man at times after the fall, how much more so might they have done so before? It could have been normal for Adam and Eve to talk to angels. It could have been normal for some of those angels to be dragons. Maybe dragons are real. Maybe some or all dragons are fallen angels, and maybe the devil was one of them, even their chief. But beyond all of this fascinating and admittedly loose speculation, the Bible offers us history that removes all doubt. Dragons are real. That's a fact. Think of Job's Leviathan, or the tannin that came from Aaron's staff to eat the Egyptian serpents. Oh yes, dragons are very real. And this makes man's interaction with them all the more important for us to remember.
In the Old Norse sagas of the gods, one finds tell of the hero Sigurd. As a boy, Sigurd was taken captive from a village that had been sacked by villains. The boy had been given to a dwarf named Regin, a demigod human who was the descendant of the giants, but due to his dwarfism, had been rejected by his kin and forced into a sort of thraldom among men. For all of the long years of childhood, Sigurd learned great lore from his stunted foster father. The boy was nourished with tales of adventure by heroes long past. He yearned to add his own verses to the long tale. He grew hungry for a fight, the proving ground of all Nordic men. As he left his adolescence and grew close to the stature of a man, Regin introduced Sigurd to the story that would serve as his doom. He told the boy about a great treasure, one that far surpassed that of all other known hoards, that lay guarded by a terrible dragon high in the dark and cold crags of the Hyperborean foothills. The dragon, Regin said, had been a giant once, indeed more than that. The giant turned dragon had been Regin's brother, Fafnir. Years before, when Fafnir had grown to his full maturity, his proclivity to greed drove him into the far reaches of the world looking for unclaimed or easily claimed wealth. In this journey, he found what he was looking for, but it cost him his form. The giant, the twisted child of the gods and eternals, became a monstrous serpent that coveted riches all alone, striking terror into the souls of all who heard of his name or approached his chrysogrim dwelling. Sigurd, driven by his fate, made plans with Regin to go and slay the worm, the bane of the northern fold. Thus, Regin forged Sigurd a mighty black sword named Wrath before the two set off on their perilous adventure. On the way, Sigurd learned of how to avoid the storming power of the dragon. It was not one that flew or breathed fire. It was a far older brood than that. This was a dragon whose breath emitted clouds of venomous air, whose blood was poison acid, and whose bulk crushed the earth beneath it. Sigurd rode with Regin into the liminal and dark parts of the world, eventually finding the deep trench in the earth which marked the path to water Fafnir was known to visit each day. There, Regin told Sigurd to dig a pit in the midst of the trench that he might hide in and wait for the worm to crawl over, whereupon the hero was to thrust his sword Wrath up into the heart of the dragon. As Sigurd dug, concern grew in his heart at the risk of being sprayed by the venomous blood. But while in this ancient thought, something strange happened. An unnamed old man with a long gray beard walked to the edge of Sigurd's pit and inquired as to what the hero was doing. When Sigurd spoke and told the man of his fear, the sage advised him to dig multiple other and lesser pits that the dragon's blood might flow into before rising high enough to reach him. Sigurd obliged before the old man vanished like a whisper into the old and ugly air of Rafia. An odd encounter. Presently, Sigurd sat in the pit of dirt that he had wrought. The night waxed cold, and Sigurd's virtue grew to spilling over. He patiently awaited the reckoning fire of dawn. When it finally came, he began to feel the ground tremble slightly around him. Soon he heard the booming steps of the worm as Fafnir walked his morning walk to his water. A shadow spread all about Sigurd like a storm cloud bringing early night to a noontide hill. Sigurd tucked himself deeper into the cleft to avoid the piercing gaze of the beast. Fafnir steadily moved until his soft underbelly hovered just over the hovel hiding Sigurd's wrath. The hero, with zeal, sprang up from his seat and pushed his black and thirsty blade deep into the hide of the creature, piercing through Fafnir's heart. The worm wrangled and writhed in pain, spewing venomous streams of breath out from deep within his bowels. The wailing moans and death throes flew from the dragon and rang through the sharp black shards of Thangorodrim rock that surrounded the battlefield. Just before Fafnir breathed his last, he spied Sigurd climbing from the pit. The dragon warned the boy, the foster son of his demonic and unwanted brother, that the riches of his hoard would last him the lives of 100 men, but that they would also certainly be his bane and death before the end. Sigurd, heedless of the dragon's warning, scorned the beast and watched it die before flying to the nest of gold it had so long coveted. Sigurd should have listened. Now, I know what you're probably thinking. You're probably thinking, you just got done telling me that dragons were really real, and then you immediately began to talk about some North myth in order to prove it. Come on, let's get to the real stuff. To that, I would say, firstly, who's to say something isn't true just because it's myth? But secondly, fair enough. Let's turn to a history closer to our own strands in the tapestry. Shall we, Ben?
We shall indeed.
Take it away, King.
In the 13th century, a Dominican friar named Jacobus de Voragin completed his magnum opus, the exceptional Golden Legend, the hagiographic history of Christ and his saints from the resurrection up to the contemporaries of the author's time. Next to the Bible, it was the most popular work of literature by far in the Middle Ages, and very many original copies of the work still survive today, which attest to that fact. The book contains wonderful stories of miracles given by God to his people in all of the church's various seasons, and provides examples of Christian heroes worthy of imitation by the young man or maiden in Christ's kingdom. One such story, the story of Saint Sylvester, is the one which teaches us how, even at Rome's second founding, plenty of dragons still remain for man to deal with. On January 31st, in the year of our Lord 314, the bishopric of Rome was granted to one Sylvester. Though at his appointment the See of Rome did not carry the weight it would soon be bestowed, he was still referred to by all as the Pope of the Church and the successor of St. Peter the Apostle. Near the beginning of his tenure, the freshly minted Emperor Constantine was baptized into the faith of Christ. This event secured relative safety for the spread of Christianity throughout the empire, a safety that grew with its authority from then on. At some time, while Constantine was dwelling in what would eventually become the Byzantine capital of Constantinople, a group of pagan priests approached the royal throne and begged audience from the emperor. When this was granted, they knelt before their king, feeling more nervous for the status of their privileges now that he was a Christian, and informed him that a dragon who had been dwelling for many years in a local pit was achieving new levels of violence and terror. According to them, 300 people per day, mostly Roman slaves, were being devoured by the monster to satisfy its appetite. Constantine was troubled by this, but had not the slightest idea of what to do. In his infant faith, he turned to his mentor, Pope Sylvester, and asked for guidance. In the presence of the pagans, Sylvester confidently claimed that he could subdue the creature by the power of Christ. What's more, he would do it without an army or any personal armament for himself. In a sort of mocking but still serious tone, the pagans promised that if Sylvester could do this, they would convert to Christianity on the spot, renouncing all their false gods without any second thought. Later that night, as Sylvester prayed and asked the Lord for help, he's said to have eventually been inspired with a plan from God. So after a night of restless and prayerful sleep, and though Sylvester was no less troubled in spirit, the trouble had turned from fear to near excitement at the prospect of vanquishing this great foe of man and God. In the morning, he assembled his team, just 2 humble presbyters from the city, who would accompany him on their journey into the belly of the earth to meet the Earth Mother's demon child spawned for destruction and blood. At the sight of such meekness stepping towards the mouth of the pit, onlookers quieted in solemn appreciation of the fact that these 3 men were almost certainly going to their death. Yet the trio remained stalwart and sure. They walked down 150 steps until the only light came from their small oil lanterns. The air was thick with moisture, but bereft of the coolness which normally accompanied such deep mines. Instead, there was only heat and stench, an oppressive sulfuric air that told tales of woe and wrath and woes more to come. Eventually, the dragon appeared to Sylvester from the shadows. It was as if he himself was part of the darkness and was formed out of it with menacing and sudden flame. The worm looked down on the servants of God with hatred, but just before it opened its mouth to consume their souls, Sylvester spoke, and the words were given him in that moment as if an angel had stolen his voice and replaced it with its own. He pronounced the name of Christ. He pronounced the glory of Christ's gospel, and he rebuked the lizard with the coming wrath of God, which was sure to fall upon him. Thereupon, Sylvester bound the mouth of the monster with a thread of divine import and sealed the knot with the sign of the cross, sending the dragon into agonized moans and convulsions until it died of hunger. And as the Pope climbed the stairs, he found 2 of the pagan magi that had witnessed his claim to the emperor the day before. They had tried to follow him from afar and watch his death or trickery, but had been overcome by the venom in the air and could descend no further. He took the swooned men out to the fresh air and light of day, and upon regaining their wits, they fell to their faces and repented of their sins, claiming their faith in the risen Christ. And so it is said that the surrounding people were freed that day from a double death of sorts. Not only would the fangs and fires of the dragon cease, but they would no longer worship the ancient Roman devils either. And this is just one of Rome's episodes of trouble with a great serpent. Far earlier in her history, before Caesar's crossing of the Rubicon and the verse of Virgil giving Romans their twisted messianic hope, another hero etched his name into the history of the dragon.
In the arid plains in the north of Africa, in a cradle tucked tightly between the Strait of Gibraltar and the Egyptian monoliths, there runs a river through what we today call Tunisia, but what used to be called Carthage. Bagrada was the river's name, and it stretched like a maternal band of nourishment from some unknown source in a desert oasis all the way to the vast bowl of the Mediterranean, giving life to a small handful of intrepid ancients who dared to dwell in the sand and who dared to defy the growing maw of empire pouring out of the high walls of Rome. At this time, Carthaginian superiority on the seas and its rich economy within its ports became too powerful and attractive of a thing for the warlords in Italy. Though peace was had for a time between the two titans, conflict was inevitable. The subjugation of the one to the other was merely a matter of course, and soon the First Punic War had officially begun. Rome fought for Roman conquest and law. Carthage fought for Carthage's survival. And before the mad genius of Hannibal graced the mountains with the treading of elephants, before Scipio made his mark on the world at the scar of a battlefield he called his greatest achievement, there was a Roman general named Marcus Regulus who picked up the chisel of his life and carved a legend of undying Roman pride into the crust of the world. For you see, as Regulus made his way toward Carthage, he was forced to cross the mighty Bagrada, and as he approached for a crossing, something smit his instincts and caused him to pause. He asked some of the local people who had willingly surrendered to the Roman march what the story was at this particular copse of forest outside of Carthage, and learned that a monster of wrath and fury dwelt there on the river's opposite bank. Fearing some sort of ambush from an unknown foe that could retire the Roman cause before it had begun, Regulus summoned one of his men to take two locals, Aquinus and Avens, to go and scout the den of the Drake to determine whether or not an approach was possible. The unnamed Roman, with the local Africans at his side, strode forth into the grove of sandstone and flint while the dry wind slowly stole all life away from them. In their approach, they took little heed for the threat that lay across the river, but that was a mistake. Suddenly, as if an invisible boundary marked the domain of this mighty serpent, the three men swooned under an intense weight of dread. They desired to turn and run back to suffer wrath, the wrath of their general, but the fear had seized their limbs and had removed all ability to free themselves from the grip of the air. All that was left was to steel their nerves and move forward, closer to the dreaded river. The men prayed to the different muses of their different false gods. Our Roman leader even prayed to the unknown god of the river he was hoping to cross to ask for succor from this unseen assault on the senses. But no help came. And as their feet drew close to the water's edge, hell broke loose from the cage of the earth that had been holding it, and death followed like the train of a bridal gown. Out of a cave's mouth there broke forth the sound of a rushing wind. Leaves were thrown from the delicate desert trees, and sagebrush was uprooted by the force of the howl. A deep rumbling shook the earth beneath the men's feet before a loud crack echoed into the aether around them. They watched the cave collapse in upon itself as if it had been waiting for all of time for this moment to send a shock of shivers down the backs of these three strangers. From the dust rose the roaring beast, crying up to heaven as one making an appeal for wrath and ruin and the day of judgment. The dragon shot its salival weapons up to the blue sky, painting it black. At this, the three men were suddenly released from their stupor and could move as they wished. They all fled wildly in different directions with superhuman quickness. Their own screams were vain due to the deafening volume of the dragon's hissing cries. Avens, one of the natives, dove to hide behind a tall and ancient oak that drank freely from the Bagrada. He clung to the bark like a baby to his mother after waking from a nightmare. The dragon whipped its muscular tail, coiled now around the trunk of that tree, and ripped the entire thing up by the roots in a single and seemingly effortless motion. Aven began to shout again, but he was quickly muzzled by the vice of the monster's jaw closing down on him, ending him swiftly. Aquinus, for his part, thought himself clever as he jumped into the river and started swimming swiftly with the current to escape the ravening maw. But the beast was not fooled. The dragon, longer than the river was wide, stretched himself into it midmost and snatched the poor man over to the other bank. He was devoured to the monster's delight, and suddenly all was quiet. Thus the Roman was left alone as the only one to escape back to the camp of Regulus. And at his word, which came only after a long period of shock, Regulus himself was stirred to great deeds. He mustered his cavalry and men, ordering them to march to the threshold of this hellish domain, where they might deal the creature a death blow befitting Rome's legions. His war cry rang out in a way much akin to the dragon's cries, only where the monster from the dark shouted from the wellspring of darkness within him, the Roman general shouted with a passionate zeal for war that reached up to the heavens. The sky became blue once again. His men, he knew, would follow wherever he led, and he was counting on that. The vast and cumbersome machine of war lumbered over the sand until the horses and ranks of men met with that same venomous boundary of dread which haunted all the earth around the beast. They faltered where they stood. Horses would not obey the bit and bridle, while veteran soldiers of great spirit stood stone still with a 1,000-yard stare of horror painted on them. Regulus sensed the dismay and the gall and galloped forth in a mighty charge. He stormed like fire itself. He thus lifted the spirits of his men and continued headlong and first in the line to the area that had just seen such wicked carnage. At this charge, the dragon belched forth his flaming darts, and acid fell from the heavens. Trees fell, and the river boiled like a mixture of witch deep in the woods. The army responded to his onslaught with a raising of the trumpet sound. It rang like gold against the serpent's dross and drowned out his hissing whines, drenching the world in hope again. Every heart was hardened with courage and with the sudden joy of war, while the dragon himself was taken aback by the forceful beauty of the legion's singing. They sang songs of death and loss, and both sides were grouped. The worm coiled itself and stood atop its mass. It stared down its foe with doubt, but as yet undaunted arrogance. Suddenly, with a speed that seemed incompatible with its immensity, the dragon lurched forward and snapped its jaws at the line of men waiting for it at the front. All horses reared once more and faltered at the attack, and the air was filled with the dying pains of men crying out to their gods for aid and strength, cries that went unanswered. The monster feasted on the cornucopia of victims before it, without a word, thought to sword or bow from any among them. The battle was proving foolhardy for Regulus, but as the Romans sank back, the general took up his own spear and threw it, with all of his life behind the thrust, through the air towards the devilish beast. The wood and iron patron of doom flew straight and true, and struck with sharpened point directly in the brow of the creature. Never before had this dragon known such a thing as pain. The odd sensation sent him wavering. How could one feel so much of something in a single moment? The pick struck there, quivering in the flesh of the beast, helped along in its force by the forward rush of the dragon itself. Yet the attack of the monster upon Regulus was not thwarted. He was forced to yank his horse here and there to avoid the supple and snapping and whirling speed of the great drake, turning now in and outside of itself to catch him. But the steed was of Orome's stable, and soon found sure enough footing to sprint out to reach its foe. The general had shown his men what was possible. They then had to gird themselves like men and follow suit. Immediately, the unnamed messenger from the tragic reconnaissance flung his own spear and sunk its single tooth into the flesh of evil and darkness. All men then did the same, until a porcupine of fire writhed in agony before them, like an earthworm turned into the sunlight on a hot day. Then finally, the siege works found their place upon the encircling hills, and the catapults flung their munition of stone at the creature until a sound like the quick snapping of a thick tree was heard all around. One of the boulders had struck its target. The drake's spine had been splintered, and black blood poured out from the severed body of the monster that could no longer hold up its own weight. The dragon fell and breathed its last on a wasted field of hellscape death that already seemed haunted by the shades of those just recently gone. One final throw from the machinations of man against men found the dragon's head lying on the ground. It was promptly crushed, and the collapsed heap of ruin that was the cave was painted with the twisted brains of the beast. A beast not less than a creature, but certainly more than just a mere animal. It was said in later days that pieces of the dragon had been brought through the Punic War back to Rome, where survivors of the ordeal were praised as heroes and of the bravest caliber by their families and neighbors. teeth as long as children, claws as long as a lion, scales broader than a hoplite's shield, and a tongue that seemed to stretch on for leagues. They said that the dragon had been no less than 210 feet in length. So have real dragons really roamed the world? We hope now that you can join us in saying a hearty, maybe. And with that, we must turn to the more important question. What are we really to make of them?
Welcome to Haunted Cosmos. We're glad you're here.
Indeed.
That was,
it's good to be here, Ben.
By magnitudes of 10, the least number of mistakes we've ever had in a read.
That was amazing.
Man.
And I just want to point out how we've kind of come full circle culturally. Because if you think about it, most of us probably came from like evangelical sort of megachurch. I was a worship leader at an evangelical megachurch and would often find myself kind of saying dramatic things over underlying music before a crowd of people. And here we are.
I'm telling you, when the music's not, like, just know that music is doing a lot of heavy lifting. When you're listening to a show, if you could somehow mute the background music, you'd be like, wow, this guy should find something else to do with his life.
Oh, man. I also just want to point out, Ben, that in true Ben fashion, you worked in 3 to 5 deep-cut Silmarillion references.
That's right.
Words
That's right.
used by no other people in the English language except you.
Orome, Chrysogrim, what was the other one? Thangorodrim,
Yeah,
thank you,
Thangorodrim.
Vi. Did we say the Vi
You
waters?
Said, we said Vi.
Yeah,
I almost
waters.
edited it out.
See, the Vi one is a really deep cut, because that's from Book of Lost Tales.
Dang.
Few people have read Book of Lost Tales.
What a kid.
Look, long story short, we're happy to be here. We're going to talk about dragons, okay? Bottom line. And I want to start by just commenting on, you know what is a huge bummer?
What?
Like, genuinely a huge bummer?
Huh.
Is that native guy who was working for Regulus?
Yeah.
He got sent, like, he's trying to be cooperative, just trying to maintain his life. He goes over there, and what happens? But that he gets immediately killed.
Immediately.
By like chomped in half by a dragon. Imagine the horror of his family. Imagine the horror, the terror. But do you know what's not terrible?
Buying soap from Indigo Sundry Soap Company. Our partners in seed oil-free toiletries, located in the lobby of our venue and selling some of the best handmade soaps and tallows that you'll ever use.
Well known to guard against the flame from the dragon's belly, Indigo Sundry soap, free of seed oils, will not only raise your tea, but it'll keep you safe from the evil teeth.
Visit indigosundrysoap.com and get your soap today.
And go visit their booth, because they're here. And they're like huge.
Yeah, wow.
If they look like Nephilim.
I can't believe we did that.
Those guys.
We joked about doing that.
We did joke about doing that. And then we wrote it. So we're doing it.
And then we
So
did.
we follow the script. Okay. When we're talking about the dragon, I
Yeah.
think that it's important to distinguish between 2 layers of the discussion.
Yeah.
There's the mythical motif, which is very important, don't get me wrong. And we can talk about that with like Jungian collective unconscious stuff. But then there's also just like, were they real? So what do you think? What do you think, Brian? Were dragons real?
Dragons were real. Yeah.
Okay, I'm glad that we can all agree with that. Do y'all think dragons were real?
Okay.
I see some hands coming up in front. That's what I'm talking about. I'm right now am repping this pin that is an image of St. George killing the dragon in England. And the thing is, it's a true story. It is a totally true story. I actually told it in our fairies episode, Peep Haunted Cosmos Season 3, Episode 2. Yeah. And you can hear all about it there. But the other thing is that, what does the dragon represent?
I mean, it represents evil.
But does it only represent evil?
What do you think?
Well,
no, I think it represents more than that. When you look at the theme of the flying fieries, the seraph, this holy, terrible, terrifying. It's kind of like you see angelic images in Scripture often. They have terrifying physical attributes,
right,
that represent a whole lot of other things, but they're not all necessarily bad because they're terrifying.
One of the things that I got to thinking about in kind of just editing this whole thing was an episode of the Friday special that we did with Right Response Ministries and Joel Webbin, Pastor Joel Webbin. And he posed the question, the common Reformed understanding of angels is that they are pure spirit. And I agree with that. And yet, whenever they encounter man in the scriptures, they don't encounter man as pure spirit. They condescend in form to a degree so that we can comprehend something about them. And the common view is that this is done in a way that's supposed to communicate some of their attributes. So, like they have the feet of an ox because they're swift, or because they're strong, the wings because they're swift.
I was going to say, oxen are not really
Dude,
that
have you
fast.
seen an ox in like full tilt?
Dude, I could beat an ox in a foot race.
How fast do you think oxen can go?
But that doesn't mean it's slow, because I'm pretty fast.
Google it.
Google it?
Google how
right
fast
now?
can an oxen run?
Someone Google it.
Maybe it depends on breed. I misspoke either way.
You were just making a serious point, and I interrupted you to make fun of you misspeaking slightly.
Yes.
Yeah.
As one does.
As one does.
What was that? 55?
Oh, I was like,
oh my
55.
goodness.
What?
25? I could beat it.
25? Come on, yeah. Dude, easy.
In this shape,
Come
this
on.
physiognomy, I could beat it.
Get out of here. Easy.
But anyway, where I was going with that was one of the ideas tossed around was, what if those forms that angels appear to man in aren't just aren't merely condescended forms that are meant to communicate attributes that could then change willy-nilly? If they wanted to communicate something else, then the form could totally change. What if somehow angels would be bound to a certain form corporeally? And the idea is that what if one of the forms is a dragon?
Wow.
And I've decided I like it.
And you've decided that you enjoy that theory, so it's probably true.
Well, here's part of why. In Job 38, God talks about how he's tamed Leviathan. And I can't remember the verse, so forgive me. But somewhere in there, it talks about how man hasn't tamed. It's like, can you tame Leviathan? The whole rhetorical method is showing Job that he can't do it. And God can. And yet, in James chapter 3, we read that all the beasts can be tamed and have been tamed by mankind. So the question
Except the tongue.
Exactly. So the question is the Leviathan, which is just a type of dragon, something a little bit more than a beast?
So you're now getting into this whole the dragon's not just because a lot of us Ken Ham kids.
Yeah.
So we're like, dragons. You mean dinosaurs?
Well, yeah. Okay.
Is what you meant by that? I'm sure.
From the Greek, terrible lizard, by the way, is what dinosaur means in the Greek.
So are you thinking here like dinosaurs were dragons,
angels.
which were angels?
Dinosaurs were angels. Confirmed.
Okay, wow. This is why the Reformed Pub is always mad at us.
That's right. Everything from the little velociraptor chicken thing, apparently, to the the T-Rex with the tiny arms, which were, by the way, the bone. They were for wings.
What?
That bone structure was for wings.
You're ruining my whole.
I mean, you don't have to be a genius. It is actually like, I did confirm this. It's not just.
You did.
Me.
Okay, you're not just.
But
making
you
this
also
up.
don't have to be like an archaeologist to be like, those arms are supposed to be the other way.
Archaeologists are not in charge of digging up dinosaurs, are they?
Paleontologists.
Paleontologists are. He went to Christian school. I went to public school.
So we didn't study paleontology in Christian
didn't.
school.
Neither of us studied paleontology. I do think it's funny that one of the things people do, anytime we see something mythical, right, that repeats and rhymes across a lot of cultures, we have these kind of demigods that like to mingle with man, and the gods are always coming down and taking a human woman and making some sort of Hercules figure or something like that. Or we see a dragon, or we see a great, like a hairy man beast in the wilderness, and Enkidu. We see all these tropes, and what we want to do is come up, like, put our little glasses on and be like, well, it was the Jungian unconscious. And we come up with this elaborate thing to basically dismiss it all, and say people just came up with that because it was kind of scary to them, and they were really sublimating their deep primeval fears and personifying them out in these mythical creatures. And a lot of times I look at that and I go, but hang on, but what if they told a lot of cultures tell stories like that because there were things like that going on.
Because it happened.
Because it happened.
I mean, think of Moses before Pharaoh in Exodus 7. It says that he threw down Aaron's staff, or Aaron threw down his staff, and it turned into a serpent. And the word used is tannin. And that's a really important word because tannin was a Canaanite demon that was a serpent with like 5 heads or something like that. It was a dragon with 5 heads that would consume and destroy everything that it encountered. And then the Egyptian magi are able to kind of match to a degree, and they go down, and it's 3 different serpents. The implication is that they're also dragons and that they're also really doing it. It's not just like sleight of hand illusion. Rare L for John Calvin. Rare.
Is that what he said?
Yeah, he thinks it's like sleight of hand. Yeah. We love him.
We love him.
But like, he almost lost all credibility with that take. But anyway, and so this idea is, what we have here is an image of God's people in the, not in the promised land, but they're headed to the promised land. And instead they're plundering the Egyptians. But already you see God in this grand display exercising his lordship and sovereignty over the pagan, demoniac, fallen, and just demon gods of the promised land to achieve his own ends.
Yeah.
It's sort of like this, like the sins of the Ammonites is not yet complete. Like God is over all of it. And he's showing that here. But it's really worth noting that the text doesn't seem to give us an excuse to say anything other than that's a literal tannin.
Yeah, and you should probably tell the whole story there a little bit, because we've said this before, but in the plagues, just the way that connects to their gods is so interesting.
So good.
In the way that God truly demonstrates his superiority over all of the false gods of Egypt. And it relates to the way the Magi were functioning, or the wise men of Egypt, the magicians of Egypt were functioning.
Before I do this, what was the 3rd plague? I know the first 2. What was the 3rd plague? No, that was the 2nd. Anyone remember the 3rd plague? Gnats?
Is it gnats?
That's what I was going to say.
I always do this. I get
Don't
them
you
all
love when
mixed
people
up.
do that? It was that's what I was going to say.
Like, oh yeah, I was going to say that too.
Okay.
Exactly.
We'll say it's gnats.
Yeah.
Someone please confirm and yell it out.
This is how we do all of our research.
Okay. So
it was gnats. Oxen, 25 miles an hour, not 55. 3rd plague was gnats.
But oxen probably could go 55 if they were scared enough.
Again, cool but not relevant.
Okay, so in the judgment of God on Egypt, there were 10 plagues. I know there were 10. And each one kind of corresponds to a certain aspect of Egyptian society that was really important. And God was showing that he's actually the one in charge, not Pharaoh. Pharaoh is a prideful false god. And he's not even like a demigod, he's just a guy. But the first 3 plagues are really fascinating. Okay, so with this whole episode between Moses and the magicians before Pharaoh's throne, where dragons are thrown out and they devour each other, the Egyptians are able to match Moses. And notice that they're magicians. They're not just wise men, they're magicians. They're performing some kind of esoteric rituals in order to accomplish this thing that Moses is able to do just by the word of his mouth. But they're able to do it nonetheless. Okay, then you get the first real plague, which is turning the Nile to blood. Turning the Nile to blood. Now, there was a god of the Nile. Particularly, there was a god of the Nile flood. And they worshiped this god of the annual flood so that he would be pleased enough to send the annual flood. There's already symbolism there that's amazing. God judges the Egyptians by killing this god of the Nile flood, and what happens? Well, his blood fills the Nile. So it turns the water to blood because the god in it is dead now, which is really cool. But when this flood would happen, one of the byproducts was that all of the frogs that lived in Egypt would begin to follow the expanding riverbank and plant their eggs at the edge of it. But now the edge of the riverbank is closer to everyone's house. So one of the things that Egyptians realized right away was that they knew it was about to be the fertile season where they were going to do really well with their crops if they started seeing more frogs in the neighborhood, or around their house. Because that meant that the Nile bank was flooding, and so the frogs were laying further up close to them. What that meant, just like with all of these old societies, is that the fertility goddess associated with the crop yield became associated with something else too. and it became associated in Egypt with the frog. And so they had this goddess named Heket, who was one of the fertility goddesses associated with the frog. But like with many other fertility goddesses and goddesses in general,
she was also the god of another thing.
She was also the goddess. Come
Goddess.
on, gender-specific language.
Look, I did not respect her pronouns, and I want to apologize.
She was also the goddess of witchcraft and sorcery. So, let's tell the situation. Moses throws down the staff. Aaron throws down the staff. It becomes a dragon. The magicians are able to do that too. And now, granted, their dragons are killed, but they're still able to send out dragons from the staff. Very impressive. And they're using magic. God turns the Nile to blood, which is very impressive. But the magicians are able to do that too. Okay. God sends frogs. That's plague number 2. He sends frogs, and he says, oh, you like fertility so much. You like your crop yield so much. You want to worship frogs? I'll give you all the frogs you can handle. And here's, God loves irony. The frogs are going to be so in your business that they'll be in your bed. Fertility goddess. There's a little prank there that's, I think, is really good. The magicians are able to do that too. I don't know how they measured that, but they were like, these are our frogs. Look, we multiplied them. Okay, but it says they were
actually a good question.
Yeah, I don't know. But I don't know how they, like, maybe they had different spots or something. Some were toads.
They had a frog-free room.
Yeah.
They're like, we can do frogs here.
Watch, frogs will reign, which has happened before in the world. So the magicians are able to do that too.
God judges that god.
Right. But in doing that, God has judged the fertility goddess. Heket, the frog-headed goddess of Egypt, is dead now. And the later plagues, starting with plague number 3, which I believe is gnats, unless I'm going to get corrected, the magicians aren't able to do it anymore.
Yeah, they can't match it.
So God kills the goddess of magic in Egypt, and suddenly the magicians have no power. Now, our takeaways from this are myriad. One, it's just really cool. The other thing is that there was actual power. The magicians really did have magical capabilities. It was dark, it was sinful, it was evil. But to pretend like it didn't exist is, I think, missing something that's really important for us. And that is that this is a haunted cosmos. There is a battle going on, and it's not just a battle against like me and my own sin, although of course that is incredibly important. It's also a battle against real powers and real principalities that you can't see, but that are working against God and against God's battalions. And so our hope is, of course, that God would continue to judge all of those gods and put them to open shame. But that's kind of beside the point. We're supposed to just be talking about dragons.
Supposed to be talking about dragons, but
anyways, frogs, dragons, I mean, what's the difference?
When God kills your witchcraft god, you can't do magic
and like
anymore.
She probably liked dragons, so there's the connection.
But here's the thing. It does illustrate a wider point that a lot of the way that, some of the as history's unfolded, people have explained why these tales have died away, is that Christianity has expanded and taken over the world and taken over all of Europe and so as Christians expanded and went through, they drove out all of the old pagan gods, and they drove out all the dragons, and they killed, and basically claimed the land for Christ. And so it's an important point that whether you think the dragons are real or not, we believe that.
Yeah, like everyone agrees in this room.
The dragons are real.
Yes. To get out if you don't. Okay.
So Ben, do you think though, I'm not fully settled on this whole question of when we look at existence of things like dinosaurs, these great lizards and that kind of thing, and then we even have many tales of people encountering historical accounts, art, things like that, depicting humans existing and interacting with these great lizards, these great dinosaurs, Do you think that there's two things going on, or one? And I'll give you the two. The two things would be that there are flying, fiery serpent, or kind of angelic beings that can be manifested in this dragony form. And that's what Eve was talking to in the garden, that kind of thing. And that then there were also animals that we might think of as dragons that have the likeness of that, but they're not necessarily the same thing. And that's part of what's going on too. Or do you think that it's just one of those two things?
No, that's a really good point. Because even if it is just an assumed form, let's say that that one of the assumed angelic forms could be a dragon. Let's say that.
Sure.
Just assume that. Well, if we suppose that, then going on the pattern of the other angels that appear to man, they would be assuming a form that already is familiar to man. So there would be just an animal dragon. It's just a
dumb beast.
Yeah, exactly. A dumb beast that naturally inclines to the things below. I think it's 2. I think it's the 2 option one.
2. All right, we solved it.
Our biggest fight.
No, I don't know. A lot of this stuff, too, I look at it and I go, I don't know. The thing I don't like doing is looking at any historical tale when there's many, many of them around the world and just saying, well, they're all made up.
Yeah, and especially when all of them feed into these metaphysical things that we know are true, like that there's a cosmic battle between good and evil. And across cultures, even in like pagan cultures, like we told that story of Sigurd and Fafnir, or Sigurd, if you're Brian.
Sigurd, I don't know, Sigurd?
I always just said Sigurd.
Sigurd?
No, with a D, Sigurd.
Sigurd.
Yeah. Not like cigar said weird. Like Sigurd.
I don't speak that whatever language it is.
Anyway, point being, even in those kind of pagan societies, there was this overwhelming theme of the hero having to kill the dragon.
Yeah.
Like it's almost universal that the dragon is bad.
Oh, yeah.
Which I really, in fact, so much so that if you go to these old wooden churches in Norway, they're called stave churches. They're hundreds of years old, very old, and really cool. And if you look up images of the inside, some on the outside, but mostly on the inside, you'll see intricate wood carvings all over the place. It's gorgeous. And all the wood carvings you might assume would depict Christian things. After all, these are Christian churches. Like, maybe Adam and Eve, maybe Christ on the cross if they're done with their second commandment stuff. But one of the things that should shock you is that none of that is there. All of these carvings depict Norse myth in a Christian church. And it was always a Christian church. It's not like it was a pagan church first, and they did all the carvings then, and then they switched over and they just decided not to redo the carvings. No. When they came to Christ, they realized that there was a seed in their myth that was true, that sprang from the true myth. And that seed was that the hero, Sigurd, has to kill the serpent, Fafnir. Now, Sigurd did it for the wrong reasons, but he still had to do it.
They're imperfect echoes.
Exactly.
But they're still echoes.
But they're still echoes.
Yeah.
And I think just the universality of that is something that's very important. And it also goes to show that you have to kill the dragon. And if you say you have to kill the dragon, people know what that means.
Yeah, they know what that, and they would know what you mean whether you're in China or Norway or the UK.
Or whether you have read all the Lewis and Tolkien that you can and it just sounds normal.
Yeah.
They would know, I have to kill the dragon.
And that's often what happens when Christianity goes to a place, is it's not that it just immediately erased all of the history of those people and the mythology of those people, but it actually gave them a vernacular to understand more rightly how the world is ordered, because they were seeing echoes. Every man has a conscience. There's a universality to the understanding of good and evil on a certain level, even among fallen men. And so there's great heroes and there's wicked villains and there's murder and there's the heroic man who lays his life down for his people. And those are fairly universal. But I like to see that when Christianity comes into a culture like there in Norway in the stave churches, basically says, now we're not even going to take away everything that you've ever loved, the stories that you've told around the fire. Rather, what we're going to do is we're going to Beowulf them.
Yeah.
We're going to teach you how Christ is really the true king over all, and how there are spirits who will deceive you. Some of them will even appear as angels of light, Paul warned about, and they'll attempt to give you another gospel and another story, and the world really is haunted by all of these spiritual powers. Let me tell you about the one who truly vanquished all of the darkness.
Right. It's a difference between Christianity coming into a place and syncretizing sinfully with the folk religion of that place, whatever it may be, and Christianity coming in and hijacking the mythology of a place, conquering the mythology of a place, not by complete desolation, unless that's necessary. Like I believe we should burn the Quran. YouTube.
Wow.
But I didn't think
Luckily,
I
we're
wasn't
live
planning on
streaming this to the
saying
internet.
sorry, NSA. But also, it's taking the myth and the seeds of truth that are found in those myths and repackaging it and showing you, no, you had something there. You had a piece, a sliver, a glimmer of light of the good, true, and the beautiful. Let me show you the whole thing. Now you can look back at that thing and see it for what it actually is, a corruption, but a corruption that nonetheless, now that you're redeemed, can point you to something true.
Yeah, it's like, so to take your highly offensive, totally politically incorrect example, like we take the Quran and we say, no, that's from a demon. But we might go through to a converted Islamic place and say, what are the stories of your heroes?
Right.
And say, there's courage there. There are these praiseworthy traits there, and they're praiseworthy precisely because they're Christian.
Yeah, it's the carvings of Sigurd and Sigismund in these stave churches. They were not Christians. It was a pagan religion, and yet they pointed them to real Christian virtue.
So do you think there are dragons today? Because I have a song where I literally repeatedly say that there are.
Man, that Neptune.
Was I lying?
He just roars.
Metaphorically, to be sure.
I don't know.
I mean, there are demons in the demonic.
Yeah, there's there's the dragon of my old heart.
Is there a cave though where there is a dragon, where I can go? Well, maybe not me. Where one could go, in like where we could go and.
Like, why not?
I love it.
It's right there. It's right there in the Bible. Why not?
Why not?
Leviathan can breathe fire. Why can't he?
It reminds me of what we in our very first episode of Haunted Cosmos, which is probably my favorite. High strangeness on the high seas. Where
we recorded that three different
times, man. And the first one was bad.
The first 2 times.
The first one, we had a sheet over us, over a lamp, like what was it called?
It was a Hampton Inn lamp
in a Florida hotel room.
It was Orlando. We had to turn the AC off because it was so loud. Man.
Oh man, if someone had walked in.
Yeah, that would have been hard to explain.
What are they doing? We're talking about sea monsters under a sheet in a hotel room. What do you think? Of course, what do you think we're doing?
We looked like we just jumped into a pool.
And
it was sweat.
Anyway, in that we talk about how, the oceans are so vast. Man has this pride where we think we know, we've seen, we've weighed, we've measured everything, and yet if we're really honest with ourselves in terms of God's creation, we've observed 0.000000000 going for our 1% of all that is, and has been.
I mean, we like to think that because we have stepped foot on some of the most difficult to reach places, like we've stood on top of Mount Everest, and it's the highest place in the world. And we think that because we've done that, we've done it all, But think of all of the different ways that you could get to the top of Mount Everest that have not been walked on before. It's like 2 main routes that people use to climb Everest, and it's heavily trafficked. There's a nearly infinite number of ways that you could get to the top of a mountain that no one ever does. And so there are countless places in the world where I believe man just has not been. Even think of the Amazon rainforest. We know now that it's full of cities, big cities. We thought it was almost totally empty, except for a few patches of people here and there. No, it was almost one sprawling metropolitan area long ago when they were just killing people like it was no big deal. Okay, and then the Christians came in and said, congratulations, you're going to stop doing that now. Convert. But in between then and now, it's become so overgrown that we've forgotten that deep history. And the only way that we're able to discover now that we were wrong, it's not by going and actually looking around. It's by shooting these LiDAR beams down through the trees. And we're using all this advanced technology to figure out we've been wrong the whole time.
About this really, it's like when I was in high school and all of a sudden, I remember this. I remember the day that they announced this. I was in an astronomy class at the time, and they were like, you know what? We just discovered that the universe is 50% more massive than we thought before.
That's a big error.
It'd be like if I had thought that you were 3 feet tall for your whole life, and then all of a sudden I was like, no, he's 4.5.
Dang.
But you're actually 6'5", I know it.
Dude, I wish. When I'm wearing boots.
Dude, easily.
You got your boots on?
Not right now.
Brian got new boots.
They're my whole
And ever since
personality.
then, he's been acting like Michael Scott when he wears blue jeans.
Yeah. So true.
He's doing like squats in the office and, dancing around.
I have ridden horses.
Man, you've reached your peak.
Thank you.
Those boots look so good on you.
In terms of time, I think we got to take
we'll need
it.
to head it on.
Do we have our pianist? We'll find her.
Where'd she go?
We'll get her.
Everyone clap when
She'll
she
come
comes back.
Yeah. There we got her. Cassie is, of course, growing a person. And so...
And fairly far along.
She can't just sit there at the piano all the time and just wait on us to stop bantering.
That's right.
Right? Well, Ben, why don't you take us into the story of Merlin and Lindisfarne?
I'd love to. And as I do, think, are there more to dragons than just creatures? And do these more than mere creatures ever take sides against man? Myth tells us that there was once a man named Brutus, and he was filled with wanderlust. He was drawn to the ocean most of all, and gave in to the waves' call in his youth. Thus he sailed and always sought out new lands and new things untouched by man. He was no small character either. In fact, his lineage was one of the highest caliber and royalty, for he was the great-grandson of perhaps the most famous pilgrim the world has ever known, Aeneas, the Trojan founder of Rome and the bane of the goddesses Hera and Athena. Once during his travels, Brutus decided to sail for the legendary promised land to the north and west that was said to be filled with adventure and riches. So it was that after a long and dangerous journey, he finally landed on the shores of the lonely isle, that Tol Eressëa which we today call Britain. This, according to the medieval historian Geoffrey of Monmouth, is how the history of the English peoples began long ago in ages past. Beginning with Brutus, Geoffrey would end his history of Britain with the conclusion of the 7th century king, the pseudo-messianic figure remembered as King Arthur Pendragon. And while the historicity and credulity of Geoffrey's chronicles can and should be questioned, neither accepted nor rejected outright, the presence of one central character in the narrative has inspired man since he first appeared on those enchanted pages. That character is the wizard Merlin. Merlin is introduced in the form of a child sage, rescuing himself from the superstitious paganism of the Britannic king Vortigern. Vortigern, wanting to solidify and protect his claim upon the throne that he usurped and stole, attempted to build a mighty fortress for himself, high in the Welsh mountains. A fortress able to withstand any siege attempt with ease, given its setting and robust internal defenses. However, after his workers had begun construction on the battlements and made some fair progress, the towers suddenly fell down. Disappointed but not undaunted, Vortigern fronted the money for new materials right away and ordered his men to begin once more. But again, the towers suddenly fell when nearing completion. Enraged at the scoffing and uncaring disobedience of this unforeseen force pitting itself against him, Vortigern ordered construction to begin in earnest yet a third time. He was like an angry man who was mad at a rock for being there when he strikes his foot against it. This time he incentivized his men to make haste, thinking that the completed fortress would be able to withstand whatever strange and malevolent attack this was. But yet again, the towers fell after being almost complete. Now dejected, Vortigern summoned his magi and astrologers to counsel him in how he might thwart the strange force which seemed personally offended at his attempts to build. Assembled in the shadow of their dark arts and deceit, the wise men told Vortigern that the gods were displeased at his wanton use of nature's bounty for such a selfish end. They demanded that he show some sign of gratitude to them for his fortunes. Thus, they told the king to bathe the foundations of his project in the blood of a child. But not just any child, one that had been born without a mortal father. Vortigern ordered his court to go and search the land to find this preternatural and strangely begotten child, and soon the court returned bearing a young boy named Merlin. the product of a human mother and incubus father. Merlin, though a youth, did not cower before the threatening intentions of the king, but rather informed him that he was a blind fool for trusting in the word of such twisted men who themselves were lovers of a wretch. And in answer to what the king ought to do instead, Merlin told Vortigern that the base of the mountain on which he was building contains the den of 2 dragons. When these dragons, one bright red and one a blinding white, rise from the waters they sleep in, they fight one another to exhaustion. This fighting shakes the hills from deep within in such a way as to be almost imperceptible to one standing on the surface, but that nonetheless weakens the stone. And this, Merlin said, is why the towers could not stand. Now, though the king was a wicked turncoat, he did not much desire to kill this unwitting child as a sacrifice to gods that he seldom thought were ever actually there. So Vortigern decided to give Merlin the benefit of the doubt and ordered his workers to delve deep and greedily into the mountain to determine the truth of the boy's strange tidings. And sure enough, after the earth had been well scarred, Vortigern's men found the pool and observed the rising and fighting of the dragons with their own eyes. All of them to a man fled in terror at the vicious hatred of the drakes for one another, all save Merlin. The boy stood his ground with a smile on his face, clapping his hands at the grand display of power and balance given by the eternal foes of one another, who are both themselves foes of all mankind. Finally, the red dragon fell, and the white dragon vanished into the wall of the mountain's cavern to resume its rest before the red dragon would return with new strength and life for another fight. For this incredible prophecy, Merlin's life was spared, and the fortress was built with new supports that protected it from the dragon's cycle. But Merlin also did not stop his discourse with the king there. He claimed that these dragons were symbols and portents of a doom soon to come. He claimed that just as the red dragon was doomed to fall, so Vortigern would fall at the hands of the rightful claimant to the throne, a warlord of virtue named Pendragon. Not many years passed before this very thing occurred. Vortigern was burned with his fortress while he screamed within its halls, and Pendragon finally retook the throne. When Pendragon died, his brother Uther succeeded him and assumed his brother's name as his surname. Upon Uther's death, Arthur Pendragon claimed the throne and ushered Britain into a golden age. In all of these reigns, that wizard Merlin was still found in the king's court, whispering wisdom to him. After the reign of Arthur, a reign marked by sure Christian virtue, and also after the retreat of the Roman legions to the mainland of Europe and the waning of the empire, Christianity became baked into the soil of England by the rule of men such as Alfred the Great and Edmund and Ethelred II. But even before their heroism, the early kings of Wessex like Cynewulf and Beorhtric were catechizing their people towards the way of God in Christ. But in a day so rife with temptations to syncretism and unholy living among the newly converted northern peoples, seeking to lead by the moral standard of Christianity proved difficult. And many villages were filled with licentious sin that would go uncondemned, but that would go condemned by the later kings like Alfred and his successors. In fact, some of those kings and members of their courts went so far as to accuse the early sinfulness of the English as the reason for their greatest ancient bane, the threat of the ambitious and unforgiving Viking raiders, the Danes. Here we find a thread so tempting and yet so elusive. For the events that will soon be related to you, the events surrounding the sacking of Lindisfarne and the harbingers thereof, will almost certainly cause you to wonder, are all dragons always against all men? Or do they sometimes take sides? To understand how the early men of Wessex might answer this question, one must know a bit about the structure of the English monarchy in the ancient days. The system of rule was based upon a society of trust that existed between the king and his noblemen. These noblemen, themselves sort of governors over districts in the realm, were relied upon by the king for their loyalty. Now, in times of plenty and peace, this loyalty wasn't very hard to come by. But in times of war, willingness to die for a king tended to decrease in the interest of self-preservation. In the hopes of fostering an organic loyalty, one that in the best cases would bud and mature into the deepest and most sincere of friendships among the entire royal court, the king would often call his noblemen to great feasts in his palace's Mead Hall. This grand hall, replete with a massive table and a fire in its center to keep men warm in the wet and cold, would host dozens of the king's closest allies and friends periodically. The mead would flow freely, the hogs would roast to perfect tenderness, and bards would retell the greatest stories of English history in song and poetry for all to hear. At some point in the night, a gilded horn of mead would be passed around in solemnity as each man took a sip from it, starting with the king. Afterwards, the king would distribute gifts to his men in the form of rings. And while it may sound like a disingenuous example of trying to buy friendship and loyalty to our modern ears, it was actually far from that. This was a display of the king, the only one in the entire realm who was truly wealthy, generously giving of his own wealth to others beneath him, to show them that at the heart of it, he was still just an Englishman. Those rings meant a brotherly bond, but that bond could be severed by disloyalty or cowardice in either direction. And if a nobleman who had pledged his loyalty to the king then proved himself to lack integrity in a battlefield or in civil unrest, he would be kicked out of the Mead Hall in disgrace and would be an enemy of all Wessex. And this image of a shamed and shunned man roaming in the cold fields outside of the palace during one of these feasts, he would still be able to hear the laughter inside. He'd still be able to smell the pork. This was a chief image of evil and barbarism to the English. So, when these men of Wessex, heard the tale of the great hero Beowulf, who slays the monster Grendel, they immediately know the nature of this Grendel when they hear that he is one who wanders outside of the Mead Hall of the king, jealous and bitter towards those within. And though not a dragon explicitly, Grendel's mother, who is a monster in her own right, certainly carries serpentine qualities about her. This is how the men of Wessex saw all the Danes, sons of Grendel and Grendel's mother, whose only friend in the world were the dragons, like the one Beowulf did eventually slay in a different part of the story. So do dragons take sides? To the men of Wessex, of course they do. And whose side do they take? Well, to those Christians, the answer was clear. They take the side of the unfaithful wanderer, shunned from the king's court, who in their mind was every single Viking man. The dragons and the Vikings were a team, and they needed to be vanquished together. And now we come to it at last. For during the reign of the Christian Beatrix, imperfect as it was, the Vikings began their raids on the English island in full force, and in a visceral brutality that remains difficult to imagine still today. And it was before the first of these full-on raids on the settlement of Lindisfarne in Wessex that the English really saw the sheer amount of evil the Viking menace was to be to them. For this raid was preceded by portents of doom, warning the king and his men to prepare for a bloody war, if only they had heeded the warnings more seriously. We read in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle the following about the events before the Lindisfarne raid of 793, quote, "Here were dreadful forewarnings come over the land of Northumbria, and woefully terrified the people. These were amazing sheets of lightning and whirlwinds, and fiery dragons were seen flying in the sky. A great famine soon followed these signs, and shortly after in the same year, on the 6th day before the Ides of January, the woeful inroads of heathen men destroyed God's church in Lindisfarne Island by fierce robbery and slaughter."
We can learn something from the stories of dragons in Britain's history, myth or not. We can learn from our Christian forefathers about what we ought to do about a dragon. We said at the beginning of the show that dragons mean something more to man than just a fascinating story here and there. Dragons require some ethical reckoning in our hearts. Why is it always the dragon that is a great foe of every great fairy tale? Why is St. George killing a dragon the epitome of every virtue, not just bravery? Why are the enemies of God always associated with the great worms? What do these things tell us about the world we live in and about the men that we are? In Homer's Iliad, we're introduced to the titular hero of the poem, Achilles, very early on. In between the lines of camaraderie amongst his men and honorable society that is attributed to his as yet unseen work on the battlefield, we slowly learn of a man whose epithet of godlike may not be the great compliment we originally took it for. To the Greeks, indeed to every society that has ever existed, excepting the Hebrews and Christians, the gods are a powder keg bunch. They do not inspire the tender affection that, say, a son has to his father in their subjects. Part of this is due to the nature of their plurality. They're not a triune Godhead equal in power, glory, honor, and strength. They're not three, or however many they are, persons in one essence. No, they are many different essences representing many different attributes, all of which are vying for the top position at all times. Pantheism is inherently self-interested. There's no unity in an ancient pantheon. There's no love. Instead, the disjointed strife and tension is the underlying tenor of every story. But apart from this metaphysical hindrance to the false ancient gods doing any good, there is, of course, the matter of their very natures, being those of fallen angels. How can they be good when the course of their immortality has turned to darkness? So when one looks at Mesopotamia, Greece, Persia, India, Rome, or even the Gauls and the Britons, one does not see benevolent rule from the gods to men. They see tyrannical temper tantrums, cloaked behind a thin but effective veil of seemingly limitless power and immortality. As gods go then, these false ones are very much like men, changing, not omniscient, not omnipresent, not omnipotent, oftentimes foolish, and even more frequently evil in their deeds. Yet they still had every right, as far as perception is concerned, to demand worship of men. After all, they were bigger. And in this larger-than-life status, the gods, as I alluded earlier, took on a specific role or area of oversight and expertise. Within this role, Zeus over the air and as father of the Olympians, Poseidon over the sea, Artemis over fertility of all sorts, Aphrodite over passion and love, Athena over war, etc., etc. They all act out in that fickle, self-centered, and mostly wicked and maleficent nature inherent to them. So when Homer describes Achilles as godlike over and over again, he's not only attributing to his hero the radiant glory and power these gods exercised, but he was also accusing Achilles for the same sins as the gods: infantile self-centeredness, narcissism, and an overwhelming focus on his singular thing to the detriment of all else. For Achilles, this central thing was violence and war. That was what Achilles was for. It is what he was made by the gods to do. And so long as he operated within that lane without care for any other virtue, he remained godlike. He remained to the Greeks a hero. In epic Greek poetry, then, a hero is not necessarily a protagonist. Indeed, Hector is the far more noble and virtuous character in the Iliad. A hero is instead one who epitomizes, in a way most akin to the gods in their domain, the skills of whatever it is they do. Thus, like I said, for Achilles, it is wartime violence. For Odysseus, it's cunning and shrewd trickery. For Helen, the runaway bride of Menelaus, who started the whole Trojan War, it's beauty and vanity. The poet paints these characters onto the canvas of our psyche in such a way as to make us loathe them as them most when they are at their most heroic. Why? Because at their most heroic, their most godlike, they are hoarders of glory, gluttonous eaters of all that is good apart from their own opinion of themselves and their own sense of honor, draconian worms feeding off the rich soil of their utter infatuation with themselves. As heroes, they are dragons, and so Achilles is blamed for the rivers of blood that painted the Ilium hills and filled the Aegean Sea with crimson life only recently lost. He is blamed for the loss, though he did not shed the lion's share of the blood, but he is blamed rightfully nonetheless. For if it wasn't for the wrath of Achilles at being slighted by the slimy Agamemnon, the blood wouldn't have been spilled, or at least not as much of it. The great and legendary Greek was a dragon, but even to the pagan Homer, there was some hope left in creation, for the dragon eventually died and only a man remained, but I won't spoil it for you.
So let us conclude with an exhortation. Bear in mind the story of Achilles, and thinking of his proclivity to hoard glory, and therefore man's collective proclivity to the same, It is no surprise that our Lord Jesus told us not to hide away the light of the gospel in our lives. It's no surprise that he told us to be a city set on a hill and lit up with good works. To hide a glorious thing so beneficial and lovely is to behave like a dragon. It is to be self-interested. And we are all too familiar with this behavior. These commands from God are not merely phrases that we should paint onto our walls. They're deeply rooted lessons that belong engraved into the tablet of our hearts. We, before God's love worked in us, were like our previous father, the devil. We were ancient worms, serpents, dragons like him. We coveted and hid. We hoarded honor and goodness like Smaug over a pile of gold. We all, to a man, were like Eustace Scrubb in the Don Treader, who becomes a dragon only to realize he had always been one. How dare we hide the glory of God's Spirit within us? How dare we tuck away Christ's victory over the world and over our hearts in deep caverns that hardly see the light of day? How dare we not show the benevolence of Christ's reign on the earth by refusing to actually love our neighbor and actually rejoice in the communion of the saints, however costly that may be? Were we to do these things, we would be no better than Achilles in his wrath or Morgoth in his envy. What's more, were we to do these things, we would be defying our God and would be shrinking back into the cold and flaking skin of the serpents we all used to be. I've said before, and I'll say many times over, that all of history, all of creation, is an exposition of those fateful words from God in the garden to the serpent. I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your offspring and her offspring. He shall bruise your head, and you shall bruise his heel. And it's true. All of time is a grand display of this decree, but it's also true in the life of every individual Christian that has ever been, every redeemed microcosmic image of God. We wrestle with the old flesh, that sinful and draconian nature that slings its haymakers at our soul while it dies its death at the hands of the Spirit. We, by God's grace and power in us, crush the dragon's head and tread upon them with our heroic Messiah of Psalm 91. We, in sober living and in penitent obedience before the Father, must kill the sinful dragon, the worm, that tempts us on our shoulder every day like a whispering shadow from a past that has already slipped into a dark night. Kill the worm. Let war be done always between you and the sin of your heart. Let the dragon die, and let the man remain. Thank you.